one chemical that just absolutely amazes me that they're not looking for is a group of chemicals referred to as dioxins. I don't know if you've heard of this yet, but when you burn a chlorinated chemical like vinyl chloride, you generate dioxins. Dioxins, this category, there's like 75 of these dioxins. One of them is the most toxic chemical ever tested in the United States. It is a nasty chemical. And so there's a reason, I think, why the government isn't testing for this, and why, if the EPA has made one major mistake in their testing thus far, it was ignoring dioxin, almost pretending like it didn't exist.
You did a great job explaining a lot of the talk about dioxins and everything tonight. The testing, the fact that is not being done, that the U.S. EPA, even at this point, still isn't providing any dioxin testing. What sort of concerns do you have about that going on, and how will dioxins potentially affect folks who live here who might encounter it?
Well, if they don't do the testing for the dioxin, then people will never understand what the risks were they were facing here as a result of this accident. They'll understand some of them, of course, but they'll miss out on a big part of the danger and the risks, the health risks. And so dioxin is an extraordinarily toxic substance. It causes cancer, reproductive problems, developmental problems, immune system problems, diabetes. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So, but these are all subtle effects that will affect people over their lives. So it'll be hard to say that it was the dioxin that did these things, but it will contribute to their adverse health.
There's a long history in the EPA. Our organization had a campaign. We wrote books, several of them, about dioxin from the mid-90s into the early 2010s. And EPA still has not released its final cancer assessment for dioxins. And they won't release it because when they did their risk analysis, they found that the risk was so high that they would have to shut down good portions of the American economy.
And for dioxins and chemicals like dioxins, once they are in the soil, they don't break down very easily. And another property of them is because they're big and heavy, they tend to start to accumulate in certain pools, and that includes some kinds inside of organisms. So we do have to think about whether, over time, if the chemicals are present in the soil, they might be present at low concentrations now, but they can start accumulating in the fluid. So they could wind up in the fish, and when you consume the fish.
I'd just like to make one comment I wanted to make on an earlier question about EPA. EPA had to know when they were going to burn vinyl chloride that dioxin would be formed. It's criminal that they didn't come forward with that. And I think it's in some ways up to the folks in this room and in this town to hold them accountable. Them and, of course, Norfolk Southern.
I guess, do you have any idea why the U.S. government at any level, the EPA, isn't testing for this?
I can only speculate. What I suspect is they're afraid that if they test for it, they'll find it. And because it's so toxic, that people will be justified in their concerns and their fears about what could happen to them. So they're kind of a little bit of the ostrich sticking their head in the sand, hoping that people don't push for this. They know better. The agency knows better. It's a long history of studying this chemical, these class of chemicals. And so the fact that they're refusing, or not so much refusing, just avoiding testing for it, speaks to me that they're afraid of Pandora's box.
I mean, that sounds negligent. It isn't even a word that can even get close to describing it, in my opinion. I mean, we're talking to folks who are already in an impossible situation here, and the government, the United States government, is afraid to test for this because they're worried about the implications. The fact that they're not worried about the people of this community instead is, I don't know, I don't even have the words to describe that.
Well, this is not the first time this has come up, and this is how government responds to these kind of situations, and that's a problem. there needs to be, this country does not have a SWAT team, if you will, a response team. When something like this happens, there needs to be a team of experts and the resources for them to do what they need to do to address the health risks. When you have an infectious disease problem, the CDC flies in and they have a team of people. When you have contaminated food problem, again, there's a team of people that come together with different expertise, and they know what to do, and they know how to test for what they need to test for. That doesn't exist for toxic chemicals. So you end up with the kind of chaos that's happening here, and it's something that's repeated itself in community after community. And that can't continue. It just can't continue.
I actually made a phone call to try to find out what kind of testing was being done. Deborah Shore answered her phone call, who's the director of Region 5, US EPA. She referred me to the on-site coordinator for the federal EPA for this cleanup. He told me that they were not testing for dioxins, that they're in the acute emergency phase, and as they transition to the recovery phase, that potentially that's when dioxins will be tested for. And he said he didn't want to dismiss the concern over that, but there's a process that they were using.
Yes.
Earlier when we were talking, we had the cattle example of if they were to ingest it, it gets into their lipids and into their liver and whatnot, that it can actually be passed on to the next generation.
Genetic, yes. It actually, they consider dioxin toxic poisoning to actually last for 3 generations. Because it actually goes in and attacks the DNA and affects the DNA, and the DNA is, a hereditary process. So,
and it sounds like the testing for this is fairly complex. I know they talked about mass spec testing, and that this is there's only a handful of labs in the country that can potentially test for this.
Yeah. Now, the doctor that was speaking and a couple others, but my latest information is that there's really only 5 labs. Now, I just talked to one of the fellows that actually is making the connection, and he's saying that they're going to hook up with a lab down in Cincinnati. What I fear is that going through a lab in Cincinnati who can't do the testing because they have to set up their equipment for the testing. They're just going to have to pass it on in a chain of custody to some other lab can handle that. I don't know. That's out of my pay grade.
I guess. Go ahead.
But because of the complexity of getting accurate testing for dioxins, doesn't make an easy process of going down to the corner and have that.
Absolutely. And then we've talked a little bit about it in animals. I mean, the effects of dioxins in people. Are you familiar with what those symptoms and signs would be?
Well, they could be. And it depends on age.
Right.
But from what I understand, you can look at things like toxic shock syndrome, vaginal bleeding, spontaneous abortions. There's quite a few things.
Right. And I'm sure they're leading in the longer term cancers and things like this.
Yeah, eventually cancer, because of the fact that the poisons, the dioxins, are not washed out of the body because of normal urine processes, and you might have heard during the thing I asked, I left it up for anybody, and the doctor answered it, it is not water soluble, which opens up another can of worms in cleaning up after this.
Right. And to just hit this point home a little bit too, currently, no one is testing for dioxin in East Palestine. The US EPA is not testing for it. The Ohio EPA isn't testing for it. There really aren't even private tests that have been published for this. And you just heard what some of the side effects are: spontaneous abortion, bleeding, cancers down the line. And no one is currently testing for this in East Palestine. If that's not headline news on every single thing everywhere.
Amen. Amen. You can't keep your eyes blinded to something that is this big of a problem in a small town community.
And just to give folks some of your background, what's your background where you've learned all of this, your expertise?
Oh gosh.
It can be the short version. I just want to make sure we're talking to an expert.
Short version. Okay. Well, I'm presently involved in what they call electromechanics. I'm an electromech and I have a company that does that. We deal with motion control. All right, keep it simple. But chemistry goes all the way back. Chemistry is fascinating. It goes all the way back to junior and senior high school chemistry, then Ohio State. I was really in a pre-pharmacy / pre-med. And so I had 3 years of chemistries, organic chemistry, inorganic, qualitative analysis, quantitative analysis. So the problems that we're seeing here, I can read them. I can understand them. You know, they're in my under my umbrella.
Yes, yeah. Well, go ahead. I was going to say, John, thank you for taking the time. If there's anything else you want to share, feel free, but I appreciate you explaining this to the audience well.
You know, I would just ask, because of the gravity of this whole thing, the perfect storm, you know, these people need prayers and all the help they can get. Because up to this point, and up to yesterday, maybe the government wasn't giving them any.
Could you explain, like, the properties behind the dioxin? Like, will it break down eventually on its own? Is it stuck here for good? Does it stay on top of the water? How does it break down in soil? If we have to rely on the environment to break this down and put it back into itself, if they don't get it out?
Dioxin is it does not degrade very easily. It will be around for many, many, many years. It's, as I mentioned, it forms the chemical reaction that creates dioxin from the vinyl chloride, for example, is largely going to occur on dust particles, particulates, that black material that you saw. And it's a large, heavy chemical, so it's going to fall out pretty quickly. It's not going to travel that far. It can.
And this has to be tested for fairly quickly because we're getting close to planting season around here. And there are root crops that will take this stuff up. Potatoes, carrots. One of the ones that I never liked Brussels sprouts as a kid, and I know now why. Because Brussels sprouts take up just about anything into their organization structure. They take up radium, they'll take up dioxins, they'll take up anything, and it'll be in there. And what you're going to end up doing is, if you buy local, you might be re-eating the stuff that you had in here.
And I think this is the other lady's question also. There are tests for dioxin in blood. That can be done.
It can be done by just anybody, or does it have to be done, how she said it, like a university where they're studying specific and have the equipment?
It cannot be done by anybody. There are only probably maybe a dozen labs in the United States that can analyze for dioxin.
That would be one of the mobile labs they bring in then.
Yes, that can be done. They could set up a mobile lab with the equipment.
Do you know of anyone that's like local for people here that do that, or are these labs that are like beyond what people here are going to be able to go to?
I don't know off the top of my head whether there's a lab here.
Joining me now, we've got John here, who we met earlier today. He informed us a lot of information on dioxin that I think would be really helpful for the viewers to understand. I guess you want to we'll recap a little bit about what we were talking about this afternoon with dioxin to help folks understand.
Oh, yeah. Well, they covered it, pretty well from the panel. But what I recently found out, and I looked at the reports that come down from the state on the water testing, they didn't even test for dioxin. Now, if you don't look for something, you're never going to find it.
Agreed.
All right. So, in my opinion, they weren't looking for something they didn't want to find. Now, you know, I told you about a short minute and a half audio. I think because of the noise level, I'll send it to you if you give me a link.
Yep.
But I think what we're looking at is a dioxin problem.
Okay.
All of the symptoms I'm seeing people are having with the chloroacne.
Explain that. So the chloroacne is the rashes that...
is one of the probably more subtle symptoms of toxic poisoning, particularly with dioxins. And you'll get an acne, extremely bad acne all over your face, maybe your neck. And this can be very, you can have permanent disfiguration on your face, neck, ears.
And this is as a result of being exposed to dioxins and...
Yes. Okay. And of course, the water issue is something else, which I think we talked about earlier today. Yep. You ingest the dioxins, and they actually go to the liver, and they attach to the lipids. Unfortunately, they never go away. They just build up and build up and build up. So if you're talking animals, and particularly like dairy and cows, and it ends up in cow's milk, it ends up in cheeses and everything downstream of that. So,
and to be clear too, I mean, an interview we'll be posting later today. We spoke to some residents who are there. They know farmers and folks who work in agriculture, and some folks, I mean, it's normal to take water out of the streams to be feeding your livestock and whatnot. I hope right now that is not the case, but that's a real possibility.
Grazing right down to the streams. So there are so many, and I'm sure you guys got the flavor from the panel. There are so many questions that were answered we simply don't know. All right, but you're never going to know unless you look. I know that they haven't been exercising all of their vision to say, well, what possibilities are out there. Chemical reactions are pretty predictable. They should have known that what they did was going to create dioxins. And dioxins don't occur in the natural. They only, when...
Man-made.
A lot of the chemicals that were in the fire, were in the train, are not necessarily going to travel much distance. The exception is dioxin. Dioxin is a fat-soluble compound. And I'm speaking dioxin as if it were a single chemical, but as Carl pointed out, it's not. And so, but it is fat-soluble. And so, if a cow eats grass where dioxin has settled from the air, it get into the cow. And that means it gets into the milk, because that's fat-soluble, it gets into the Hamburg, and so on and so forth. So any animal that feeds on or drinks water that's been contaminated will, if for dioxin in particular, will accumulate that compound. And then, if, like in the fish in particular, it bioaccumulates so that the smaller fish might get it, and then the bigger fish will eat it, and they'll collect all the dioxin in the smaller fish, so that if they eat, so you can see how eating 10 smaller fish, you're going to have quite the concentration.
We've been talking to residents for the last week at this point who live on some of these streams, and Leslie Run in particular. Today we were talking to some folks who they were saying right after this happened, I mean, the water changed color, they could smell it basically all night. What do you think, with your knowledge of the subject, the type of restoration plan that's going to need to come into place? How long is something like this going to take to clean up?
Well, when you're talking about restoration plans, that's really a challenging thing to talk about, because each part of the stream is going to have a different restoration plan. The first thing is to stop the additional contamination. And then you have to go in and reevaluate and look at each location of that stream that's contaminated and figure out which chemicals they were contaminated with and make a plan. Thing that was really talked about today is that there's not one contaminant that was released. There's not one chemical. There's a suite of them. And each area is going to have a different level of each of those, and some may have some contaminants and some may not. So a really thorough understanding of what's in the site is what's going to need to be able to clean it up. And whether or not it can be cleaned up to a safe level is another question as well. Right,
and absolutely. It seems like a concern with water and with air. There's a list of chemicals that we know came out. There's a list of things that we know, things like dioxins and whatnot was obviously heavily discussed tonight that aren't being tested for. Is this something that we've seen in other instances when there's a disaster? I'm not sure if this is an area of expertise for you, but where testing is being done, but certain things are seemingly being left out that we know exist. I mean, the US EPA isn't testing for dioxins. That seems like a major red flag to me. I'm not an expert in this, but is that something that we see with these sorts of cleanups?
Sometimes the cleanups prioritize cost, availability, and speed. And that isn't always the safest way to prioritize testing. So we have seen in past instances when the right things aren't being tested for. That doesn't mean what they're testing for isn't the right thing to test for. They're just missing things. So just because you aren't lying or you're not doing something, that doesn't mean it's a complete picture. And so that's what we're really advocating for here, is a complete picture. Just a couple sites sampling for a couple different things and coming in and saying it's safe is not the whole picture, and it's not allowing the community members to determine their actual amount of risk that they're exposing themselves to. Also, safe is not a black and white answer. Safe is a spectrum. It's amount of risk. And each home, and each area, and each lifestyle is going to have a different amount of risk. And that's really something that the individual needs to take and understand to be able to decide what they want to do about the contamination in and around their home.
And it's so tough. I mean, hearing you say it, it's like prioritizing speed and money. These are people's lives we're talking about. These are people's children we're talking about. These are people's animals we're talking about. It's been driving me nuts seeing all of this stuff happening. And again, the fact that the biggest concern in this room tonight was clearly the things that we need to be testing for aren't being done. We had the gentleman holding his little newborn baby, or his wife is holding their newborn baby. I mean, how can we be in the United States of America pretending we're caring about everyday people like the residents in this town who frankly deserve way the hell better than they're getting? I don't even know what to say about it.
I mean, that's a fair concern, a fair observation, and definitely what we're seeing now. I think the idea that we're, not necessarily prioritizing the people, the problem is we're prioritizing reducing panic, which means they're prioritizing not sharing all the information. And that's the challenge. They're making assumptions that this community, that these individuals can't make their own decisions about their own risk if they had all the information. So instead of allowing them to decide if it's safe or they're willing to accept the risk of what is possible in their living and staying in that area, they're taking that away from them and just giving them blanket answers, which is only causing confusion and mistrust. And that's not going to allow for a prolonged cleanup, which is what's going to be needed. This is a multi-year long, if not multi-decade long process that's going to happen. And it's going to be a really long time until we really see the true repercussions of our health in our community.